mountains to be settled. But the folks who do come here, the question they have on their mind is, can you raise tobacco here? And they found out that you can. We grow some of the best dark fired tobacco anywhere in the world right here in Appomattox County. They also found out you can grow just about everything you need here for both human and animal populations. Uh, it's a perfect place for family farming, but because of the institution of slavery, it is also an ideal area for plantations. And that's what we have here is a mixture of those two types of farming. Slavery is important to both of them. Prior to the war, over half of the population of this county are slaves, and 2/3 of the families here own at least one slave. Okay, I give up. Come on, let's go on over here. There's already a thriving city off in that direction. It's called Lynchburg, and there's a thriving city down in that direction. It's called Richmond. And a road developed between those two cities, and it passed straight through this area. And you see the remains of the road today, right here on both sides of the courthouse. In 1809, they improved the road so that stagecoaches could travel from Lynchburg to Richmond more easily. And they named it the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road. Now, it's the highway of the day, and that's the reason this village is here. But this road is also the reason that Robert E. Lee came here in 1865. Now, in 1819, there's a gentleman named Patterson, and he's operating the stagecoach company. And he comes here to this area. He's looking for a site to build a stage stop, because this is about one day's journey from Lynchburg. So he bought 200 acres of land here from a local plantation called Clover Hill, and he built that tavern over there as his stage stop. Now, he also built the guest house, the kitchen, and the slave quarters. So those four buildings really are the beginnings of this town. And then in 1845, the little village that had grown up here around that stage stop, people were calling it Clover Hill after the plantation that was here. And this little town is selected to be the county seat of the new county, Appomattox. Now, the first thing they do when they come here is they built a jail. It was over there in the corner of the courthouse square. It's no longer with us because during the war, they arrested a young man for something. I don't know what he did, but when he got out, he was not happy, and he burned that jail down. So the jail that today is really the new jail, it was not finished until after the war itself. Then they started construction of the courthouse. And then that's when they changed the name of this town. We've become the village of Appomattox Court House. And that's to conform with the way we name our county seats here in Virginia. It's the name of the county, followed by the two words, courthouse. So when you see that, it means it is a town, it is the county seat. When you see courthouse, one word, it's a building. So Lee and Grant never set foot in that building, but they did meet twice in this village. Now, the name Appomattox, a lot of people want to know how to pronounce it. Well, I hope I've said it enough that you know how to pronounce it now. And others want to know where it came from. Well, it came from the Appomattox River. The Appomattox River starts just a short distance over in that direction. And the Appomattox flows to the James River below Petersburg at City Point. Now, in colonial days, there's a group of Indians that lived where those two rivers came together. And they called themselves the Appomattox. And that's an Algonquin word that means people of the land of the tobacco plant. So they named the Appomattox River after the Appomattox Indians, and then they named this county after the river. So that's how we got our name. Now, one thing they found out, when you build a courthouse, lawyers are going to come to town. And there's nothing you can do about that. So lawyers came. Some of them built law offices. We got a little law office over here on the other side of the store. It's a great example of the type of office of the day. In fact, some of that structure is original. Some of those families also built homes here. The White House, built by a family of lawyers by the name of Bocock. The Bocock family furnished the first two clerks of the court and the first Commonwealth attorney. Now, his name was Thomas Bocock, and he went on to become a United States congressman. He represented this area for 13 years prior to the war. He was heavily involved in the politics that led up to the war. But he's a Southern Democrat, and he is a slave owner, but he's not a secessionist. But when war came, Thomas Bocock resigned from the United States Congress and went to Richmond. He became a Confederate congressman, and Thomas Bocock was the first and only Speaker of the House of the Confederate Congress. He was a powerful man before and during the Civil War. Now, there's another house just the other side of the courthouse there that can't see from right here, but it's a blue-gray house. It's the home of George Piers. He's clerk of the court in 1865. But I pointed out to you because if you have time today, walk the stage road down to Mr. Piers' house, and you're going to see some displays on both sides of that house that are well worth the walk down there if you feel like it and have the time. This is a prosperous town for about 10 years. The rumor had gotten started even before the new county was formed that a railroad would come to this area. And they were hoping it was going to come right here. But in the mid-1850s, the railroad came, but it didn't come here. And if you look around, you'll see why it did not. But you go up this road about 3 miles, you'll come to a ridge line, and that divides portions of two major watersheds. On this side of the ridge is Chesapeake Bay, and then on the other side is Southern Rivers. They go to the Albemarle Sound, North Carolina. So that ridge line is a really good place to build a railroad. That's what they did. So the South Side Railroad connected Lynchburg, Petersburg. They put a little siding out here to call it Appomattox Station. And from the moment the railroad began to operate, this little town began to die. So the first thing to go is the stagecoach business. Then the taverns began to suffer. Now, at that point in time, there are two major taverns in this little town. The Clover Hill Tavern and the Rainey Tavern. No longer with us, but the Rainey family had come here. You may have noticed there's a nice monument across the field. That's the Rainey family cemetery. They were well-to-do when they came here, and they built that brand new tavern there, went into competition with the Clover Hill Tavern, and then they built that nice brick house. And that's a guest house for the Rainey Tavern. And they intentionally made that one of the most luxurious buildings here in this town. But when that railroad came, the Rainey family fell on hard times financially. They had also lost several members due to typhoid, and they decided to move on. So they put their property up for sale, and they moved on. But the property didn't sell very quickly. It wasn't really until after the war had started that a gentleman out of northern Virginia came here and bought that property. He didn't want the tavern itself, but he did want that nice brick house. And in 1863, he brought his family here, and they made that their home, and his name is Wilmer McLean. So, folks who come here today sometimes will ask us, why would Robert E. Lee come to a little dying village in central Virginia to surrender his army? Now, you may or may not know the answer to that, but if you're interested in a little bit of discussion about it, I'll be glad to do it if you are.
I'm interested.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to take you back a little bit to spring of 1864. Abraham Lincoln is President of the United States, and he's finishing up his first term of office. He's making plans to run for re-election. Lincoln really does want to serve the second term. He wants to see the war come to an end, and he wants a Union victory at the end of the war, and he wants to see this nation reunited. But the problem is Abraham Lincoln's going to lose the election in the fall of '64, unless something about the war changes, because people in the North are sick of the war. You may have heard that expression, rich man's war, poor man's fight. And it was used by both sides, but it started in the North. Now, don't let me destroy any illusions that you folks might have about politicians. There have been instances in the history of this country where political considerations influenced military decisions. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Yeah.
And Abraham Lincoln is no exception. He made several decisions during the spring and summer of '64 that were designed to manipulate the war and improve his odds of getting reelected. Now, one of the decisions he made, he brought a gentleman by the name of Ulysses S. Grant to Virginia, put him in charge of all the Union armies. He basically turned over the conduct of the entire war to that one general. It wasn't a popular decision with many folks. People said, President Lincoln, that man drinks. And Lincoln said, find out what that man drinks. Let's give some to the rest of my generals. That man fights. That man will do the terrible arithmetic. And Grant did bring a different philosophy with him. He knew the war could not be won by taking Richmond. The only way the North can win the Civil War is to destroy the Confederate armies. And that's what Grant set about to do. So when you hear about the exploits of a gentleman by the name of Sherman down in Georgia, you hear about Sigel, Hunter, Sheridan up in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, Red River Campaign in Louisiana. They're all things that are being coordinated by Grant and Lincoln with the intent of changing the war so that Lincoln can get reelected President of the United States. Their plan is to take the major Confederate armies all through the South and keep them separated from one another. Don't let them get together, make them fight, and destroy them on the battlefield. And if you can't do that, you destroy supply lines. And you take the war to the civilian population to destroy morale and support. It's called total war. So Grant affiliates himself with the Union Army of the Potomac. That's George Meade's army, and that's the army that's dealing with Robert E. Lee and his army in Northern Virginia. It's the 1st of May, 1864, that Grant ordered Meade to cross the Rapidan River and begin what's called the Overland Campaign. Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna River, Totopotomoy Creek, and then a place called Cold Harbor, just outside Richmond. And no one knows who won most of those battles. There were no real winners, but Grant did something that none before him had done. It didn't matter if he won or lost. He kept coming. He kept making Robert E. Lee move, defend, and fight. So when Grant came to Virginia, they called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. When he got to Cold Harbor, they were calling him the Butcher. Grant lost over 50,000 men in a little less than 2 months. He lost 6,000 men in less than 1 hour at Cold Harbor. Now they found Grant in his tent on at least one occasion weeping over the casualties. You know, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, neither one of them is the devil, and neither one of them is God. They're generals. They had to make tough decisions. And almost every time they made a decision, men were going to die. I think that weighed heavily on both of them during the war. But it's at Cold Harbor that Robert E. Lee told his staff, he said, if we don't destroy Grant here and now, before he crosses the James River, this thing's going to become a siege. And then it's just a matter of time. And sure enough, less than 2 weeks, Grant crossed the James. He attacked Petersburg. That led to a siege. It's going to last almost 10 months. And it's during the siege of Petersburg and Richmond that Sherman took Atlanta. And Jubal Early got defeated by Union forces up the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, and the South lost the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And those two things gave Abraham Lincoln the change he needed in the war to get him reelected. With the reelection of Lincoln, all hope that the South had to end the war with a negotiated peace agreement of some type is gone, because Lincoln will not back down on the issues of secession and slavery, and neither will the South. So now it's going to be decided on the battlefield. 1st of April, 1865, Union forces got around Robert E. Lee's right flank near Petersburg at 5 Forks. The next day, Grant orders an all-out assault from Richmond to Petersburg, and the breakthrough occurred. And Robert E. Lee realized he can no longer hold those two cities. So he orders an evacuation. He orders his army to report to Amelia Court House. That's a stop on the Richmond-Danville Railroad. Lee ordered trains with food and supplies to be waiting for him at Amelia Court House. His plan is get his army there, feed them, rest for a short time, and then they're going to march down that railroad through Danville into North Carolina. Lee believes that if he can join his army of Northern Virginia with Joe Johnston's Confederate Army of the Tennessee, that those two armies combined can whip that gentleman named Sherman. See, Sherman is done in Georgia, South Carolina. He's now in North Carolina. But once they take care of Sherman, they're going to come back to Virginia and deal with Grant. But Lee's army gets strung out. The roads are in terrible shape due to the weather. Creeks flooded, bridges washed out. They get strung out. They don't get to Amelia Court House in a timely fashion. And when they do, they discover there's everything but food on the trains. So that's at that point that Robert E. Lee made a critical decision. He decided to spend an extra day at Amelia Court House and to let the stragglers catch up with him and to let the men forage for food in the countryside. That one day delay cost him dearly. You see, the Federal Army, you may have thought they would have taken a few days off, kind of enjoyed the fall of Richmond, but they did not. Remember the goal. The goal was to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. So they kept coming. They're in pursuit. They're also racing south and west, trying to block Lee's route to North Carolina, and that's what Sheridan did at Jetersville. He blocked Lee's route. So the next day, when Lee decides what to do, he decides not to fight, but to head west. So his goal now is to get to the town of Farmville, 30 miles south of us. There's food there. There's food and supplies on trains nearby Rice's station. But it's the same plan. Get them to Farmville, feed them, rest, turn south, go to North Carolina. But Lee's army gets strung out again. A gap develops between the vanguard and the rear guard. Union forces are harassing his line of march. Every time the rear guard has to stop and fight, the gap's getting bigger and bigger. And finally, cavalry for the Union catches Lee's rear guard at a place called Sailor's Creek. And that leads to a major battle. In fact, there's 3 battles that are occurring at the same time. And during those battles, additional Union cavalry arrived. They rode into that gap and they cut off Lee's rear guard. And Robert E. Lee lost a fifth of his army in the fight at Sailor's Creek. 8 generals were captured. One of them is his own son, Custis. Now, the boys who survived Sailor's Creek retreated from that battle using what's called the High Bridge. That's part of the Southside Railroad. And when they did that, they crossed the Appomattox River, put them on the north side. And the rest of Lee's army is still over here near Rice's station on the south side. So Lee is now faced with another critical decision. He's got to get his 2 groups back together. And Lee's decision, for whatever reason, is to take the whole army north of the Appomattox River at the town of Farmville. And he's going to burn all the bridges behind him and separate himself from the Union pursuit. But one of those bridges didn't burn. There was a small wooden wagon bridge down below that high bridge. And the Union cavalry got there in time to put the fire out. They saved that bridge and they marched right on behind Lee. Union infantry's coming, they go behind and they keep the pressure on Lee, so he can't stop in part. He can't rest, he can't feed his troops, he has to keep marching. So he marches on into Cumberland County. And they catch him again at Cumberland Church, and he digs in there on the afternoon of April the 7th, but Lee survived that battle. And then during the night of the 7th and the 8th of April, Lee slipped away from Cumberland Church, basically undetected by the Union forces. He began the 3rd night march in a row, and that's the march that's going to bring him here. Now, when Lee made that decision to go north of the river with his whole army, one of his own generals, looking at a map of this area, he said, "We're in a jug. We are trapped between 2 rivers, the James to our north, the Appomattox to our south. We can't go east. We've got to go to what he called the neck of the jug." Now, the neck of the jug's right down there in that bottom, less than a half mile from here. It's where this old stage road crosses the Appomattox River. It's the only point that Lee's going to easily get back to the south side of the Appomattox River. And the only way he can get here is this road. So when he slipped away from Cumberland Church, he marched into Buckingham County, and at New Store, he got on this road, and he proceeded to head this way. Now, General Grant can read a map, too. He realizes the situation Lee is in. He divides his forces. He takes 2/3 of the Army of the Potomac. Their orders are, wherever Lee goes, you follow him. But he takes 1/3 of that army and keeps them over here south of the river. He takes the Army of the James, keeps them south of the river. And their orders are, you march to Appomattox by those highways. And if you can get there in time and block that stage road, then we're going to end this thing at Appomattox. Now, Grant's got a 3rd army. It's called the Army of the Shenandoah. That's Phil Sheridan's cavalry. Sheridan's got spies, call themselves the Jesse Scouts. They are Union soldiers, but they're dressed like Confederates, and they're in Robert E. Lee's army. And they intercept orders that Lee sent from Farmville to Lynchburg to have trains with food and supplies waiting for him at Appomattox Station. So Sheridan's job is to follow the railroad to capture those trains and deny that food to Lee's men. So it's a race. Who's going to get here first? Well, Robert E. Lee's got a head start, but these Union folks have 8 miles less distance to travel. So as it turns out, they all get here at the same time. Now, when Lee begins to arrive down there in the bottom, they hear the train whistles blowing, the food's there, it's waiting for them. As they prepare to go out there and get it, they begin to hear gunfire. And that's the Army of the Shenandoah. Specifically, it's George Armstrong Custer. He got there first with the division of cavalry, and he captured those trains. And he denied that food to Lee's men. And then Custer, realizing that he's in front of Robert E. Lee, that he has won the race, he sends men in this direction, find out where Lee is, and they almost immediately run into the vanguard, leads to what we call Battle of Appomattox Station, goes on into the night. It's going to end right down there on the other side of the courthouse about 10 o'clock that night. They're fighting by the light of the moon. The thing that ends it is when that cavalry goes riding around the courthouse, they run into Robert E. Lee's infantry. And that drives them back. So they go back up there to the top of that hill and they block that road. And they're hoping they can hold Lee here until that Union infantry can get here and reinforce them. Now, Custer took 1,000 men prisoner that night. He destroyed 200 wagons, captured 25 cannon. He's clogged this road with dead horses and mules. But he knows he can't hold him here until those boys do get here. So when morning comes, Robert E. Lee has made the decision. He's going to make one attempt to open the road and see if they can escape. So the Battle of Appomattox Court House is right out there in that field on the morning of the night. At first, the Confederates successfully clear the road because it's still just cavalry on top of that hill. But as the fight continues, fog and mist that had covered the battlefield and had made them unable to see one another very well began to burn off. And they looked in the distance, and one of them said it looked like a wall of blue coming. The Army of the James and the Army of the Potomac. Union infantry, they marched during the night. They covered 30 miles in 24 hours. They got here in time. So that's what's going to lead to the meeting to discuss the terms of surrender. Lee requested the meeting by letter. Grant said, I'll meet with you, and told Lee to pick the place for the meeting. So Lee sent his aide, Charles Marshall, into the village to find them a building to use for the meeting. And the first white man that Marshall met was Wilmer McLean. So that's the reason that the meeting takes place in the home of Wilmer McLean. He reluctantly agreed to let him use his house. The meeting itself lasts an hour and a half. And at the end of that, those two generals do come to terms for the surrender of Lee's army. But when Lee came in here that afternoon, he wasn't sure he was going to surrender. He came to see what the terms were going to be. He had asked James Longstreet one of his most trusted generals, before he left, what terms do you think Grant will offer? And Longstreet told him, he said he's going to treat you the same way you would treat him. But if he doesn't, break off the talks. Come on back. Tell Grant to do his worst. Well, thank goodness that didn't happen, because there are now 95,000 soldiers within 5 miles. There are 30,000 Confederates just across the river. There are 30,000 Union just to their rear. There are 35,000 Union in front of them. So if Robert E. Lee had broken off those talks, Grant had done his worst, thousands of men could have died here. As it was, somewhere between 1 and 200 did. But as Robert E. Lee read the terms, he realizes how good they are. He's not going to be Grant's prisoner. He had come prepared. He'd worn the best uniform he had. He had on a ceremonial sword that he'd never worn before. He had come prepared to be Grant's prisoner, but he's not. In fact, none of his men and none of his officers are going to be prisoners of war. Grant's trying to say any Confederate soldier here who will agree to lay down his arms and go home and not fight anymore until proper exchange will be paroled. Now, folks, you won't find a Civil War anywhere in history that ended like the American Civil War ended. Historians say it's Grant's finest hour. Terms he gave Lee at Appomattox. That's true, but it's also Robert E. Lee's finest hour in many regards, because he accepted the terms, and the bloodbath was avoided. But what some people overlook is this: Lee had 3 options at Appomattox: fight, surrender, or obey the orders of Jefferson Davis, his commander-in-chief. And those orders were, do not surrender, but disband the army, let them become guerrillas, and let them scatter to the countryside. And Robert E. Lee disobeyed that order because he did not believe in guerrilla warfare. And by doing so, he prevented an untold period of lawlessness that would have resulted from turning the Army of Northern Virginia loose as guerrillas. And the man that gets the credit for all of this is Abraham Lincoln. Less than 2 weeks before Appomattox, Lincoln met with Sherman and Grant at City Point. They knew the war was about over, and Lincoln said, "Gentlemen, can we end it without much more bloodshed?" And Sherman and Grant both told him probably not. And so Lincoln told them, he said, "You do whatever it takes. But when the time does come, let them up easy. Let them surrender. Let them go home. Treat them with respect." That's exactly what Grant did. He wrote the terms, but it was Abraham Lincoln that set the tone. Now, the next morning, April the 10th, General Grant, after spending one night over that ridge, comes riding back down through this village. He goes down to the river. He encounters Confederate soldiers down there guarding the river crossing. And he requested a second meeting with Robert E. Lee. Lee agreed. Those 2 generals meet down there near the river by the side of the road on horseback for about 30 minutes that morning. Grant said, "General Lee, if you'll give the order, there's not a rebel soldier anywhere in the South who won't lay down his arms at your command. Will you give the order?" And Lee said, "No, that's not my decision. That's the decision of Jefferson Davis." And then Lee said, "Can you give my men a written parole? Proof they can carry with them on the way home that they are not deserters, that they're not renegades, that proof that you told them they can go home undisturbed." And Grant said, "Yes, we can do that." He ordered a printing press set up in the Clover Hill Tavern. They're going to print a little over 30,000 parole slips, 28,231, give or take, are issued here at Appomattox. It's a valuable piece of paper. Grant issued orders that made it even more valuable. That parole slip is a ticket. That Confederate soldier can ride a train. He can ride a boat. And it's a meal ticket. He can draw rations with it all the way home, any federal facility he goes by. So that meeting ended. Grant comes on back up through the village. He goes back to the McLean house. He's going to spend some time there, wrapping things up, but getting ready for a journey that's going to take him to Washington, where he'll meet with Abraham Lincoln on the morning of April the 14th and give him a first-hand account of everything that took place. Now, while Grant is there at the McLean house, 6 generals approach that house, 3 from each side. They are the Surrender Commission. And after speaking with Grant for a few moments, they go into the parlor and they carry out the orders they have been given. And that is to plan the surrender ceremony. Grant insisted that there be a ceremony. 2 reasons. He wants to reward his men for what they did, but he wants those Confederates across the river to know they have been beaten. This is a surrender. This is not a peace agreement. He wants them to respect that. So those 6 generals plan the ceremony. It takes 3 days. On the afternoon of April the 10th, Confederate cavalry that did not escape, and many who did and came back, they ride into the village and they lay down their arms right here in the stage road. And we don't know a lot about the ceremony, but we know they got to keep their horses. They were given a parole, and they were allowed to leave. And then on the 11th, some more cavalry surrenders, but it's the artillery mainly that surrenders across the river. They get to keep their animals, and they get their paroles, and they start home as well. And then on the 12th, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 Union soldiers come marching over that hill down this road. And as they enter this village, they line the stage road on both sides to the courthouse. And then from the other side of the courthouse, all the way down the stage road, past Mr. Pierce's house, just over the ridge, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is in charge of those men. He's down there at the head of the line on horseback, and he's looking over into the Confederate camps across the river. His orders are to accept the surrender of Robert E. Lee's infantry. So as Chamberlain watches, 10 divisions of Confederate infantry line up in the stage road across the river. They unfurl their battle flags, and they start marching towards this little village. Now, the first group to cross the river and come up the hill are led by John Gordon. And as they enter those 2 lines of Union soldiers, Chamberlain gives the order to sound the bugle and carry arms. And John Gordon recognized that as a show of respect, so he ordered his men to return the salute. So Lincoln's desire for respect, dignity, pretty much the way it was done. It took almost 7 hours for 22,349 Confederate soldiers to march in here one division at a time. They stacked their rifles here in the stage road, mostly on the other side of the courthouse. They took the accoutrements and left them there. They took their battle flags, the ones they didn't hide or tear up. They furled them, left them here, and then they marched on back across the river to their camp. They were given a parole, and they immediately started walking home. The Appomattox is not the end of the war, but it's the beginning of the end. And in some respects, Appomattox is the beginning of the nation that we are today. Consider less than 1 week after that first meeting between Lee and Grant, Abraham Lincoln is dead. All the plans that he made to bring this nation back together with malice toward none. All the plans he made for 4 million